So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rolnik. I organized this conference with Luigi in the last 3 years, and I also chair the subcommittee of the news media. So, unlike previous panels, in this panel, I will be both moderating the panel and presenting our report. And some of you would think that this is a conflict of interest, but as you know, running the platform and selling on the platform is still lawful in the country until we adopt some of the recommendation of this conference. So I intend to exploit this loophole while we still have it. I want to thank all the members of our committee, Julia Cagé from Science Po, Joshua Gantz from Toronto, Ellen Gundman from Rutgers, Brian Knight from Brown, Andrea Prat, and Anya Schifrin from Columbia. This is a draft. Members agreed on all in identifying the problems and almost all of the solutions. I will focus my presentation on analysis of the problems and laying out the rationale of the direction we took in the proposal. Julia Cagé will present in detail our main proposals on funding, and Andrea Prat will present our antitrust approach. So, Me Too is probably one of the most important movements of our generation. Many reasons for it, accumulation of a lot of events for a very long time, but the inciting event was, of course, Harvey Weinstein. So 1 week before Me Too, the New York Times and New Yorker exposed Harvey Weinstein. Interestingly enough, those are the publications that were able to persuade women that were harassed by Weinstein to speak out, despite the fear of retaliation that can potentially destroy careers in Hollywood forever, were these two particular publications. And the question is, why the New York Times and the New Yorker? So what is it about two news outlets? They have very long tradition of particular type of journalism, and they are known to be very impactful. But it's interesting to see how those publications perceive the balance of power between the news outlets and who has power. So this is a quote actually from the New York Times media critic right after the Harvey Weinstein expose, explaining to the readers of the New York Times why it is so difficult to expose people like Weinstein. He calls it a protection racket. There is a protection racket, a network of aggressive public relations flacks and lawyers who guard the secrets of those who employ them. The racket is a formidable opponent for anyone who is trying to expose the truth, uses everything at its disposal to wear down reporters or break their wheels, either by wooing them or through smears and legal action. Note, this is the New York Times, who tend to think is one of the most powerful player in the news media. So there is a broad consensus among most scholars that we cannot, even economists, that we cannot have a functioning democracy without free press. If I had to, and there is a few quotes here, if I had to choose two, I would quote, of course, George Orwell and Walter Lippmann. By the way, the George Orwell quote, I changed it in the last moment to Grace Kelly, because turns out that we don't really know who said that. It's attributed to Orwell, and also I found it that it's attributed to Kelly, and I wanted to have her on the slide. News is something someone wants to be suppressed. Everything else is just advertising. And Walter Lippmann, the present crisis of Western democracy is a crisis in journalism. In our report, we focus on the news, on this particular kind of news that has positive externalities, news that can potentially have public benefits and not private benefits, and this is some literature on the importance of this kind of news, actually mostly from economists. Now, most news Strangely enough, we mentioned that news is, the news media and accountability journalism is a democratic institution, but strangely enough, most of the news is actually produced by for-profit corporations. And this is interesting because investigative journalism is very, very costly. First of all, we have very high fixed costs. We have unique high hazards like lawsuits and antagonizing the funders, the advertisers, and actually every political player and every significant business player and his or her friends. And of course, the revenues are uncertain most of the times. So the starting point, and this is important to stress, the starting point of our report is the assumption that news, and especially investigative journalism, also known sometimes as accountability journalism, has the characteristic of a public news. News is undersupplied, it has under demand. Investigative journalism is social. Consumption of news by others raises the value of that news. It has longevity and is very, very risky. So in this context of the news media, we now move into the era of the digital platforms. We identify in our report 4 concerns for the production and consumption of news. Most of them are intertwined. Change in the news outlets' business model, shift of the distribution through digital platforms. Platforms are now curating news through opaque algorithm, and incentives that are more and more aligned to curate viral and visceral content. So we discussed here yesterday, again and again, the business model of two-sided markets. So I want to remind all of you, especially the people that are younger, that actually it is newspapers that were the companies that exploited the business model of a two-sided market and its network effect way before Google, Facebook, and even Microsoft. The important thing about classified advertising was not only its huge margins, it was a very profitable business with very high margins, but the fact that you had the newspapers, the news outlets had very, very dispersed source of revenues, sometimes thousands or millions of small advertisers, and later we'll see when we talk about advertising, why is it so important. So what changes with the introduction of the internet and the platforms is that newspapers gradually lose the display advertising and abruptly lose the classified advertising. So let's quickly look at the time frame here. So it is actually not Facebook and not Google, it was Craigslist. Craigslist started in 1995, but became a for-profit company and started enjoying the fast penetration of the internet only after the 2000s. And now let's look what happened after Craigslist is becoming the classified, the digital age classified. So this is how the picture looks like. You can see that the advertising drops, and later you see first advertising drops because classified advertising went from a $20 billion business only in the US to almost zero. By the way, we don't have real numbers up until only up until 5 years ago, because the Newspaper Association of America just stopped at some point showing those embarrassing figures on advertising of a newspaper. So revenues, as I said, drops from classified from 20 to 0, and revenues from display ads dropped by more than half. In our report, we demarcate 2 periods, first the internet and then the platforms. Up until 7 years ago, news outlets did believe that they will be able to transition their advertising to the digital era. Now they know it's not going to happen. In the report, we explain actually why this is not going to happen, because newspapers, news outlets, any news outlets will not be able to compete with the platforms with their trove of data and their targeted advertising business, which is very, very complicated. So what do I do when I lose a third or half of my revenue? It's easy, I know, I've done it. So I cut the costs. I merge, I close. Now, we all know that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are actually thriving, and the New York Times is especially thriving after after Trump. They call it the Trump bump. But these are a few national, maybe winner-takes-all outlets. And across the country, we have thousands of counties, as many people discussed yesterday, with no newspaper at all, or with one or two newspaper. We can also see how this is the picture of the news deserts, and you need to update it now every 2 years. What we also can see is how the Pulitzer Prizes are getting more and more concentrated in the big national newspapers. And some people say that there have been, when they describe that, they actually say that there have never been a better time to be a corrupt politician on the local level, on the local and the state level, as in many states there is no one left to report. And this is important to know. This is in many ways the focus of our report is the local, regional, the local and the regional newspapers. And a new paper, interesting paper, also shows that once you don't have that reporting, actually borrowing costs goes up when cities and counties lose daily news papers. So this is quickly. So the disruption of the business model is only half of the story. The second half is what happened to distribution and consumption of news. What happened to news with the rise of the platform. So this is how news was distributed and how the business model looked like before the platforms. And now this is how it looks after the platforms. Actually now, the platforms are not only the ones that are taking more and more and more of the advertising, but they are now the means through news is being filtered. So how does this world look like? The producer of news used to be the curators of news, the bundlers of the product. In many respects, this was one of their most important roles. Now, curation or bundling is shifting gradually to the platforms. They have a better business model, and they are now curating the news. Around half of the US population get their news today through the filtering of the platforms. Now, we do have to understand for people that are in the news media, people who owns news outlet, people who run large editorial team, it's sort of obvious to them, but it's not also obvious to many of the readers. Platforms not only disrupted the business model, like I said, like it was said here time and again yesterday. Platforms changed the entire news ecosystem fundamentally. They disintermediated the producer of news from the readers and viewers. They split the world into billions of individual editions, and they atomized the news product. News outlets don't sell anymore editions or bundles. They sell story by story. This has profound impact on what kinds of journalism gets attention and what kind of news is produced. Before the age of digital platforms, we had pretty good sense of what people are consuming, what kind of news they are reading, viewing. Now we know very, very little actually what's happening there in the news ecosystem. Now, before I continue this track, I want to stop for a second and remind us that chasing sensation and visceral content was not invented with the platforms. This is my favorite cartoon here. If you don't recognize, this is Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Their commercial incentives drove them many, many times to produce very particular sorts of news. Here they are, of course, accused of drumming up the war with Spain for commercial reasons. But something very important has changed. News producers have now the technology and the incentives to constantly adjust and tweak and sometimes even target the news to get more attention. They can do, for instance, constant A/B testing to headlines, to photos, and framing of the story, like never before. We heard it actually yesterday from Chris Hughes. I asked him about what lessons does he have from Facebook and the owner of the New Republic. And actually, he said that he does have misgivings that they were chasing Facebook. They was chasing the virality of Facebook. Now, Chris Hughes bought the New Republic not to make money. He knew that it's losing money, and he just wanted to break even. But even he had to succumb to the new ecosystem of Facebook and the pressure of the Facebook and the kind of news ecosystem that we have. This is an example of what happened to editors in newsroom once they know that what goes viral. And full disclosure, I worked in those newsrooms for many, many years, and I know what kind of software those newsrooms are using more and more. The Washington Post, for instance, would use many times the same exact software to curate news on its website that Amazon uses. Very sophisticated stuff that A/B tests and changes a lot of things just to make sure that you get more virality over the social network. So we always had this attention-grabbing incentives in the news media, but with the social networks, it really is much, much worse. Many news outlets before the digital platforms had incentives to prioritize quality content when they still control the distribution. As we move to a world that news is filtered through algorithm on platforms, there are less and less incentives to do it. And of course, the platforms have very little or maybe none incentives to prioritize the quality content. So before we go into the proposal, I quickly want to look at the market response to everything that we've just seen in the last 10 minutes. So first of all, we have more and more philanthropic money going into funding news outlets. We have here the logo of ProPublica, but of course, there are many outlets out there, like the Intercept and many, many more, and it keeps going up. Then we have, of course, the revival of the subscription business. Particularly successful is the New York Times, that is gaining in the last 2 years many, many subscribers after the last elections. But I do want to remind all of us that it was only less than 10 years ago that the New York Times was bailed out, because it was before it almost went bankrupt. It was bailed out by Carlos Slim, another kind of monopolist. And the next market response would be the collaboration and technology. So this is like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers. And actually, we really do like all the technological advances that happen that help all the people who produce news do things much more efficiently. And technology is helping a lot doing it. But as we'll see later, even when we talk about technology, it has its limits. And the last private market solution initiatives like NewsGuard is rating of the sources. Now, so what are the shortcomings of those market responses? When we talk about philanthropy, we usually have the same risk of capture. We all think that those are benevolent players, but still they are the ones that are many times setting the agenda, the perimeters of what is relevant and what is that they want to investigate and to go. When we look into the subscription, this is a very good business model for only a few players. It doesn't work up until now in most of the outlets, and especially the local ones. Now, when we talk about technology or things like the Paradise Paper or the Panama Paper, this is a great boon to journalism. But at the end of the day, in the case of the Panama Papers, 380 journalists, old-style journalists, were needed to work on the Panama Papers and to exercise their judgment. Now we move to the solution. But before we have the presentation of Julia and Andrea, I would like to explain briefly our rationale. Much of the proposals out there today, and people are concerned about the newsma, focus on rebalancing the power between the platforms and the news producers, as we heard yesterday. This was initially something that this committee also has looked into as well. But the problem is that the members of this committee, at least most of them, are old enough to remember the days before the platforms. And we don't think that those were so glorious days. News media was always biased by political and business players, mainly advertisers. The authors of this report think that if we give news outlets a bigger slice of the revenue from the algorithm, we are actually cementing an unholy alliance of clickbait with monopolists. And I think that this alliance is very, very dangerous, and there is not enough discussion on it. So if we let those monopolies still have those rents in advertising and just push some of the money to the news outlets, actually we have a situation what economists would say just sharing the rents. So we're not here to protect those advertising revenues for incumbent news outlets, but to offer a proposal how to create a better news ecosystem, which takes me back for a second to the question, why was Weinstein actually exposed only in 2017? I don't know the answer for that, but we know that a lot of people tried to see what's happening with Weinstein because there were multiple of accusations. And some people think that actually Weinstein was a very powerful political player. One of the reasons that was raised that he was also a big advertiser. And so the question is, because maybe he had a lot of leverages on the news media, like many powerful players in the private, in the public sphere has on newspaper. So therefore, we propose a new ecosystem, which is different than the current ecosystem and the ecosystem that we had before the digital platform. We think that this ecosystem is more competitive. So Julia Cagé will present the public funding approach to journalism and the news media, and Andrea Prat will present the how to regulate media concentration, maybe a more Brandeisian approach. We also include in the report something that came up here time and again, especially in the political committee. The idea is that all the information about news consumption that is currently in the hands of Zuckerberg, Sergey, and Larry has to be available to regulators and academics, because today we are living in a strange world where we don't know much about the news consumptions of society. Only the platforms know who is consuming, why are they consuming, and how algorithms are changing first, what are we consuming, and sometimes how does it change our behavior. So we propose, so in line with this regulator that was mentioned here time and again yesterday, we propose that we need to have all this information available to the regulators and then in delay to the public. And the last thing is that like other committees, we were reluctant to totally repeal Section 230 at this point. As I said, we don't really know about the news consumption on the platform. And we sort of offer a quid pro quo approach that says that if platforms, they want to continue to enjoy this subsidy of probably tens of billions of dollars subsidy offered by the protection from lawsuit in Section 230, will have to abide by certain disclosures and conduct in order to continue to enjoy it. Thank you, and now please, Julia Cagé.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy, for the invitation, and also Luigi. I'm Julia Cagé. I am an assistant professor of economics at Sciences Po Paris. I used to work on the economics of the media, and I published a couple of years ago a book called Saving the Media. And I guess this is why Guy asked me to join the group. Also, I am French. I am not saying that because of my accent, but just for you to understand why we are going to defend public funding of the media. I think Guy just did a very good job at convincing you that we are in the middle of a journalism crisis. And in fact, we were happy between quote yesterday, because yesterday was not the day about the media, but all the conference and all the different sessions were talking about the journalism crisis and the fact that we need to do something about it. And what we do in our report is that we try to propose a number of solutions to solve this crisis. Guy already presented some. Andrea is going to talk after me about antitrust issues. And here what I want to focus on is one of the proposals of the report that we called the media vouchers. That is an innovative form of public and participatory funding of news. I want to underline first that the public support to journalism is far from being a novel concept. And you have a lot of people working either in economics, in law, in communication studies. Unfortunately, McKinney won't be here like today, but we were like hoping like some of like strong support on his side that argue in favor of some like public funding for media outlets. And in fact, if for a moment we forget about the US, the majority of the developed countries tends to have, as of today, a number of different schemes to fund the media outlets with public money. For newspapers in particular, and increasingly for websites, you have both direct and indirect public subsidies to news media. Like in a lot of European countries, you have reduced value added tax for news media. Very often you just have like 0% value added tax for news media. You have tax credit, you have postal subsidies, you have operating subsidies, etc., etc. Plus, in fact, we don't have to forget, very often people say, yes, but you take European countries, but consider the UK. In the UK, there is no public funding for news. It's not true. In the UK, you have a lot of public money into the news industry, which happens through the funding of the BBC. And at the end of the day, on this table, I put all the money spent on the funding of public broadcasters like TV and radio in a number of European countries, plus the US. You see that in all developed countries, basically people, the government spend between 30 and $130 per capita every year to support the public media, except the US with just $4 public subsidies to the public media in the US. And if you also look at how much we spent on like funding the media, not only like public radio and TV, but also newspapers in a number of European countries. In a country like Finland, in euro per capita, we tend to spend more than 120 euros per capita in the funding of newspapers and public service media. And this is not only for the public radio and TV, this is also like direct subsidies to newspapers. This is also the case in France, this is the case in Germany, this is the case in Italy. And again, here the only exception is the US. So one of the questions we may ask ourselves is, perhaps the US are right, and you know when you watch public TV in the US, you may consider that the quality is much better than the one of the BBC, or perhaps the rest of the world at a point. And I want to say that very often we tend to forget a lot about history, but the US was the very first country historically to invent public subsidies of newspapers, and it was in the 18th century. Then they decided to forget this way to help media outlets, but I think it may be a good time to reintroduce public subsidies of news. Now I know that public subsidies are not a perfect scheme, and in particular because they raise an important threat, which is the one on the independence of the media and the independence of journalism. And in particular, and this is the case in a country I know pretty well, which is France, but I think that both Andrea and Luigi would agree that this also happens from time to time in Italy. Public subsidies may be used by government to keep the media in line. This is one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is that they can be completely misappropriated, in particular if they are allocated to media outlets that are not going to provide information defined in our report as public good. So this is why we decided to propose a new scheme that is going to avoid media government intervention into the media, which is a private media voucher system funded with public money. So here is our proposal that we call the media voucher. the idea is to give each adult a media voucher. So we are going to argue for a $50 value in the report, but that we can discuss the amount. What is very important, I think, is the setting of the voucher. So the idea is to give each adult a media voucher from the US Treasury to donate to her favored media outlets. And this is really in the spirit of democracy vouchers that are implemented as of today in the US, in the city of Seattle, that have been defended in the US for a very long time by people like Larry Lessig, and that I defended myself for like European political parties in a book I recently published, whose title was The Price of Democracy, and I think this includes also the media. So how would that happen concretely? Concretely, every year when you will fill your tax returns, you will indicate to the tax administration the media outlets to which you want to allocate your media voucher. This may sound technical, but I think an important point is that we really want to preserve anonymity. So we don't want the IRS to know, to which media voucher to which media outlets you allocated your voucher. So to preserve anonymity, you will be provided with a token, and then this will be done through protocols of anonymous voting, for example, using the blockchain. Okay, so I just want to give you like 2 examples of how it could work in concrete terms. The very first one, you may know that this is your tax form in case you pay your tax in the US. And what you see here, this is the presidential election campaign. So I don't know who in this room used to check the box for the presidential election campaign. Okay, so even less than on average in the US, which is just like 30% of the people. But you have this opportunity. Each time you fill your tax form, you can ask the tax administration in the US to give $3 for the presidential fund. The big issue is that the money is no longer used for presidential campaign, given that all the candidates have decided to opt out the public funding system. But I can tell you that the media outlets won't opt out the public subsidies. The other example, and this is a little bit to convince Luigi, this is an Italian tax form. And just to convince you that if the Italian government can handle it, I think the US government can also do this kind of reform. So in Italy since 2014, when you fill your tax form, you can indicate the tax administration to which political party, in this case, you want some public funding. So this is a share of your amount of tax you pay in Italy, to which political parties you want this amount of money to be allocated. This is done while preserving anonymity, and this is a new way to fund political parties in Italy. So technically, we know how to implement this kind of vouchers. Now, I want to enter into the detail of the voucher, and I think this is where we may turn to important issues. First question that is kind of key: who are the media outlets who could benefit from the media vouchers? Our objective here is that we want the list of media outlets that could benefit from the vouchers to be as extensive as possible. Because what we want is to avoid any government intervention, and we really want the media vouchers to be allocated directly by the citizens. Okay, what we really want is the citizens to decide which media outlets to fund. So if we begin by deciding a very small list of newspapers that could or not benefit from the vouchers, we think it won't be a good idea. So we say, okay, we need to have a list that is as extensive as possible, with one exception: we want the vouchers to be used to fund the production of information. So we don't want it to be used, for example, just to fund the production of entertainment. So basically, we just imposed a small number of conditions the outlets have to respect to benefit from the media vouchers. They have to appoint at least 1 journalist. You may say that 1 is not a lot. We have decided for 1 because now there is a debate in Canada. So the Canadian government just implemented a new funding scheme for media outlets. And they say that the newsroom need to have more than 2 journalists. And it turns out that a lot of new players who want to benefit from public funding just have 1 or 2 journalists, and they cannot benefit from that. So we just say, okay, 1 journalist will be enough. The second thing, and this is where it might be the most difficult condition to define, would be to produce mostly produced general interest news. The third point, and I think this is a very important point and a very important issue, is that the media outlets will have to be transparent, in particular regarding their ownership. we have a big issue, not only in the US, and in fact less in the US than in a lot of European countries, because in the US the media outlets, they tend to be publicly listed. So at least if the media outlets are publicly listed, we can get some information on ownership very easily. In Europe, the media outlets, they tend not to be publicly listed, and for a lot of them, we cannot determine the list of their owners. I think they need to be transparent regarding ownership. So one condition a media outlet who want to apply for the media vouchers will have to satisfy is really to publish the list of all its owners. We can say above a certain threshold, like 1 or 2%, but be transparent regarding ownership. And the fourth point, and in fact, yesterday Fiona did a very good job about that when talking about the digital authority, will be to be ethical. We won't enter into the detail of the digital authority because it was discussed extensively yesterday. But obviously, if you have media outlets that only published fake news every day on its website, it may not be eligible for the media vouchers. The only thing I want to highlight here is that for the independent news monitor, but I guess we will agree with the other groups on this point, we don't want any government member. Because if we want this news monitor to be independent, it needs to be entirely independent from the government. The second question is who are going to benefit, in a sense, from the media vouchers, and how to guarantee an high enough degree of pluralism and avoid concentration. And in particular, our main threat was that potentially all the vouchers may be allocated by the citizens to small numbers of media outlets, and in particular to the media outlets that tends to be the most well-known and the most successful as of today. And we don't want the media vouchers to be captured by 1 or 2 big players, and in particular not by 1 or 2 big players doing particularly well on the market. So we decided to introduce a threshold. And we decided that a given media outlet cannot receive more than 1% of the total number of media vouchers. So let's say that we go for a $50 media voucher. In the US, we have around 260 million adults. It means that no media outlets would be allowed to receive more than 2.6 million vouchers, which correspond to around $130 million. So then the following question is, what is going to happen in the event of an over-allocation? Okay, like first year we implement the media voucher, like 5% of the people decide to give the media vouchers to the New York Times. I'm not saying that because you are like in the first row and because you are French. What is going to happen in this case? In this case, in fact, we have decided that the media vouchers are going to be allocated following the allocation of the vouchers by the rest of the citizens. In fact, when you have this sort of problem, there are like two possible solutions. One is to decide that, okay, so then the media vouchers won't be allocated, but we think that we need to put enough money into the media industry, so we want these media vouchers to be allocated. And the best way to do it independently is just to use the allocation by the rest of the citizens. And in fact, we decided that it will be good to implement the same rules in case the citizens decide not to fill the media voucher information on the tax form. And this will happen for sure. Like, look at the presidential fund. A lot of people, they just don't check the box. So in case citizens decide that she does not want to choose, does not want to indicate a media voucher to which to allocate, a media outlet to which to allocate the voucher, then the allocation will be done according to the preferences expressed by the rest of the citizens. Just to give you an idea of the media vouchers in numbers, so I told you that the media outlets cannot receive more than 1% of the total media vouchers, which amount to around $113 million. And the question is that, is that a lot of money or not a lot of money? Obviously, like for small media outlets like pure players, like new entrant, it's a lot of money. But the point I want to make on this slide is that this is also a lot of money for existing players and even like existing players that are doing pretty well these days from a financial point of view. So basically, if you take the New York Times, the typical New York Times reporter salary is $110K a year. I don't know whether you want to protest either with me or... No, you don't know. Okay, so basically with $113 million, you can pay for around 1,000 New York Times reporters. This is to be compared to the current size of the New York Times newsroom, which is 1,450 journalists. Compared to the total revenues of the New York Times, you may tell me that this is not a lot of money. Like the subscription revenues of the Times are $1 billion these days, but still this is 1/3 of their total advertising revenues, and this is more than their 2017 operating profit. So for the New York Times, it will be as multiplying the profit by 2. So I want to say that even for large profitable media outlets, the media vouchers, they can make a difference, and they can allow the media outlets to invest more in journalism. And if you look for local newspapers, this will make a huge difference. Basically, this will be a way to open up new outlets at the local level that has to shut down in recent years. So let me just spend the last minutes I have trying to convince you that the media vouchers are both better than the status quo and that other proposals that have been made. Why do I consider that they are better than the status quo? So if you look at the status quo in the US, there is no public funding of the media. If you were convinced by Guy's presentation and the argument we make in the report defining the information produced by the media as a public good, you may believe that we need to have more public money invested in the media. I want to say that, in fact, in the US, as of today, there is a lot of public money invested into the media indirectly through the tax deductions associated to philanthropy. So then you may just tell me, so we may prefer the status quo and have more tax deductions for philanthropic donations to the media. And in particular, as of today, it's kind of hard for media outlets to qualify to the 501c3 status. So let's allow media outlets to qualify to this status more easily so that they will benefit more from the tax deductions. First of all, we think that the media vouchers may be a better solution because philanthropic funding of the media presents a number of shortcomings. This is a little bit like the funding of the media by government. When government decide to directly fund the media, they may have their own agenda. When philanthropists decide to directly fund the media, they may also have their own agenda. So in a sense, we think that rather than using public money through tax deduction to support the preferences expressed by a small number of rich individuals, it would be better to use the same amount of money to fund the preferences expressed by all the citizens, by giving all the citizens the same amount of public funding that they can allocate through the media voucher. And this will be a way to ensure pluralism, and this will be a way to preserve media independence. Now, if we look at the status quo in Europe, in mostly European countries, but also in Canada, we have a number of schemes to subsidize the media. So, like, a solution would be simply to increase the amount of public funding. Like, compared to direct subsidies to the media that are in place as of today, the media voucher, they guarantee independence. So there is no government intervention in the public funding allocation. So from this point of view, they are like a much better scheme than a lot of other existing schemes. Then you can tell me, yes, but then if we look at reduced VAT or like a number of tax relief, we also solve the problem of independence, because with the example of the reduced VAT, there is no government intervention either. That's true, but the problem is that if you look at the numbers, and by definition, in a sense, the tax relief, they benefits mainly large media and large media that are profitable. But what we want is to have a mechanism that is going to help new media outlets, small media outlets, and small media outlets that are not profitable at all. We also believe, but for that we would need to have a try. And in a sense, perhaps if you don't buy the media voucher for now, it would be better to implement the solution at the state level for a couple of years and then to have it extended at the national level. But we believe that this may also be a way to reconcile the citizens with the media outlets. If we look at the trust numbers, like I think we all know here that the confidence crisis is huge for the media outlets. Basically, people, they don't believe the media. In particular, if you ask people, what don't you trust the media? A lot of the answer is about the fact that they don't trust the media owners, and they think that this is not transparent enough. With the media voucher, we ask transparency, and we also think that this would be a way for the media outlets to communicate more with the citizens, so to establish direct relationships between the media and the citizens. Last thing, there have been like a number of like other solutions that have been proposed by a number of people. Some people argue in favor of a free subscription to a media outlet. So basically, the government will offer a free subscription to each citizen to the media outlets of his choice. We think that the media vouchers are a better scheme for two reasons. The first reason, and I think this is an important reason, privacy is preserved. I think there is no reason that I have to tell people whether I prefer to read the New York Times or the Washington Post or watch Fox News or read Breitbart. I can do whatever I want, and the government do not have to have this information. So at least with the media vouchers, we preserve privacy. And the second thing is that the media voucher, they can also benefit the media outlets that offer free content. And I think we really want to also support the media outlets that offer free content. We also think that this is a better funding model, that a number of arguments into just like funding grants for journalism. First of all, I think Guy has a good argument showing that there is an increasing concentration regarding the Pulitzer Prize. So this tends to help like big players that are already successful, like not new entrants. But what is even more important, I know that we like the Me Too movement, we like the Panama Papers, we like the Paradise Papers, we like when there is large investigations at the national level, okay? Because this is what we're going to read about. But this is not what journalism tends to be about on a day-to-day basis, and in particular at the local level. At the local level, journalism is about having journalists sitting in a room, listening to government members, discussing about like very lengthy and very boring meetings, and trying to see whether there is a problem of misallocation or whether there is a problem of corruption. And this won't make the headlines, but what we lack today is not investigative journalism working for large newsroom. What we really lack is day-to-day local journalism with deeply locally involved journalists. And this is what the media vouchers are going to help funding. So I just want to conclude by saying that when I told my colleague in France that I was coming to Chicago to convince the audience that the way to go for journalism was public funding, they told me, you know, if you convince this audience, you may convince the entire world. So I think I convinced you at least a little bit. Thank you very much.
Andrea Prat, please.
Thank you. So I'm here to report the results of our committee on media concentration. The main theme is public goods. We think that political information is a public good, and I'm just giving you a summary of where we're going, and that concentration is a big threat to this public good. We think that the current rules are not adequate, are not enough, and we want to go toward a new definition of plurality, of a plurality review. And I'll give you some sense of what it could look like. We're thinking of something that's based on attention shares. And there's a lot of open questions that I want to share with you. Political accountability. We keep our government accountable with information. Information comes from the news. Now, this is a public good, right? This is an important public good. Why is concentration a problem? Concentration is a problem because if the people who are supposed to inform us are in the hands of very few owners, this is more likely to lead to capture. What's capture? Capture is the government and the media striking deals, or perhaps the media owners running themselves as politicians and manipulating public opinion. Now, this is one of the best documented facts in the political economy of mass media. Anya Schifrin has a whole book documenting this across various contexts and various geographies. Now, this is more likely to happen when a new platform new technology is coming in. One example that's close to my heart is Italy in the 80s. Commercial television begins. There is no rule against concentration. And one particular media owner, Silvio Berlusconi, acquires one TV station after the other until he becomes a monopolist. And then we know what happens after that. Capture is present documented for many countries, included, if you're interested, I find the Levson report in the UK very interesting. This is not a new problem. We've known for a long time that media concentration is dangerous for democracy. That's why we have rules. What kind of rules do we have? We have two types of rules. One is platform-specific media rules, and the other ones are regular antitrust rules. I am going to argue in the next two slides that they're not enough, okay? So platform-specific rules, they exist in the US. They exist for radio, television, and print media. And basically, they say that if you own companies on those platforms, there are limits as to whether you can buy other companies on the same platforms or other companies in those three sets of platforms. Now, those rules worked very well in the 50s and 60s. Why? Because the set of platforms was stable, was small and stable: radio, TV, and print. They don't work anymore in today's world because the set of platforms is very dynamic and fluid. The number of platforms is expanding, the internet, social media, so on and so forth. And the boundaries between platforms are blurring. The same article, the same New York Times article can be read in print, can be read on your social media, can be read on your internet, so on and so forth. So these rules, by and large, have no bite. When they have a bite, it's very arbitrary. Regular antitrust. If two media companies want to merge, they also have to go through the regular antitrust hurdle. Now, that's meant to do something else. It's meant to protect direct consumer welfare. It's meant to protect what consumers are getting from the companies that are merging. By and large, we're thinking of prices. We worry about situations where merging companies will raise their prices afterwards. In the case of media, this has typically very little bite because prices sometimes there's no price because it's given away for free. Usually the price is very inelastic. And the starkest example is the case of a company that owns media on a certain platform, newspapers, that wants to merge with a company that owns media on a different platform, television. Typically, that's a non-event from the point of view of antitrust. And instead, from the point of view of democracy, we worry a lot because it's creating more control of public opinion. So we think, and this is the first conclusion we have, that we need to broaden a little bit the goal that we want to have. Rather than protecting purely consumer welfare, we have to think about citizens' welfare. And we have to start from the idea that this is a public good, or in the case of capture, a public bad we want to protect. So our preliminary conclusion is that we need a new form of plurality test, and this form should apply obviously to any sort of transaction that leads to larger companies in the new world, and should have a bite in a world where the set of platforms is changing. we don't want to have something that works today, because I am pretty sure that 10 years from now, we will have platforms that we're not thinking about today. So it has to be platform neutral. It has to be something that will work no matter what the set of platforms is. Now, we're thinking of something that will be performed in parallel with antitrust review. So two media companies want to merge. If they also own news outlets, they will be subject to both the standard antitrust review as well as this new plurality review. And that's very important. We want it to be based on something that is at least potentially objective and quantifiable. No decision in antitrust is ever completely quantifiable. There's always subjective decisions, but it's important to have some variables we want to look at. So one of the ideas we're thinking of is thinking about attention, an attention-based review. How does it work? So remember, our goal is to get something that is platform neutral. So we have two news companies that want to merge. How much should we worry? How big are those companies? Now, you could have within platform measures, you could look at circulations if they're newspapers. But how do you aggregate that? What do you think of when you think about social media? What's the right measure? And what we think that the important unit is, the unit of measure is the attention of users, of voters. So and that will allow us to aggregate across platforms in a natural way. So how do we do that? If you get a sample of voters, you understand where each of them gets their political news from. Not their entertainment, not their weather forecast, but their political news. And you can do it in many ways. We'll discuss that in a second. But you try to understand how they divide their attention across news providers. And then you assign that attention to each news providers. So Guy spends 50% of his time reading the New York Times. We allocate 50% of Guy's attention to the New York Times. And now, once we have that, we can aggregate across voters and figure out what the overall attention share of each news source is, no matter what their platform is. This could be social media, this could be internet, this could be a platform that we haven't invented yet. Now, let me, so let me give you some numbers. I'm going to show you some numbers that I have collected, and then I'm going to show you this has already been used in a merger decisions in the UK, and so I want to show you how it was used. Now, I've been collecting these attention shares for a while, and I now have it for 36 countries. This is what you get in the US with, and then we'll critique the data in a second. This is how, according to the data I have, Americans allocate their political news attention to. So as you can see, there's a variety of companies operating on a variety of platforms. The largest, according to this data, is News Corp, mainly because of Fox News. Here you see the New York Times. Now it's interesting, why is News Corp so much more important than the New York Times? It's Fox News. Why is Fox News so much more important than the New York Times? Two reasons. The first one is more people watch Fox News than read the New York Times. But the second one, and it's equally important, people who read the New York Times have other sources. I think that's a very important consideration, because it means that stuff that happens to the New York Times is not as important as stuff that happens to Fox News. This is how it was used in a merger decision in the United Kingdom. The decision was made last year. I believe the report came out in July. This was Century Fox trying to buy the rest of of Sky. They already owned 39% of Sky, and they wanted to buy the rest. If I hope I get the percentage right. So what they did is they computed a very similar measure. They computed the attention, how a sample of UK voters allocate their attentions to various sources. And as you can see, it's interesting, they divide, these are intermediaries. These are sources that do not produce their own content. Now, you look at the two merging entities, Sky and News Corp. This is their attention share before. If they were allowed to merge, this would be their attention. So what the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, concluded was two things. They said from a market power perspective, there is absolutely no problem. This merger is fine. It's fine because we don't expect prices to change. These are mainly in different markets, mainly newspapers and TV. But we're going to block the merger on plurality ground, and they did block the merger because we are not comfortable with this number here. This would create the largest news provider in the UK after BBC and ITN, which have different governance structure, and we'll discuss that in a second. So this is one way where that this can be used. Now, after being so enthusiastic about doing this, I want to say that there are a lot of open questions. The main one is, these are pretty pictures, right? I know what data went into that. The data is not good. The data is not good because I'm a Columbia professor, and I've been looking for the best data I can find. I've been using many data sets, and there's a lot of problems. These are surveys mainly. So the most important thing for the new authority we want to create is that they collect the kind of data that people like me cannot collect. This is not going to be easy. It's going to involve a mix of soft survey instrument as well as hard instrument stuff that sits on your devices, and you want to combine all these things to get a very good picture of what people's news diet is. That is data that we're totally missing. So I think that one of the core competencies, core duties of an authority in this area is to collect the data. Now, there's a lot, we are thinking of attention as one metric. There is a lot else that we can think of. So first of all, attention could be measured at the local level because there's a national level, and we know that the news at the local level are extremely important, and there's a lot of concentration there. The Sinclair-Chicago Tribune merger is an interesting example of that. It would have created a lot of concentration at the local level. Now, one big question on which I think there is a lot of debate is which authority should be in charge of this? One possibility is to give this to the antitrust authority, the regular antitrust authority, for instance, the DOJ in the US. That's good because typically these authorities are efficient and not captured. It's also bad because they're already overextended and they have a clear mandate. So in the end, our committee thought that the best thing would be to give this mandate to a digital authority, if we create that, and let the two reviews run in parallel. Let the two reviews run in parallel, and a merger between media companies have to overcome both hurdles. There is a lot of other important stuff, and I think perhaps Rod Benson will speak about this. This is not the only limit to ownership we can think of. So a merger is one particular limit to ownership. We don't allow you to buy new companies, but even without changing, without transactions, there are some forms of ownership that are more problematic. So we should think, and we have less strong views on that, that certain types of ownership are particularly bad. If you think about private companies that are wholly owned by one particular person, this means that that person has a lot of power on the editorial team. They can easily fire a director that's not doing what an editor that's not doing what they want them to do. So we could think about limits on encouraging public companies rather than private companies, and then we could think of limits to ownership for people who have ties to government, either because they are in government or because they have other companies that are closely related to government, perhaps because they work in regulated industries. This is a classic thing that happens in pretty much every mid-income country I know. If you own companies in, say, the oil industry or in telecommunications, companies that depend a lot on government regulation, the first thing you do is you buy a newspaper or a TV station and you use it to threaten government if government is not nice to you. So one thing we may want to introduce is that if you happen to own one of these large companies, you cannot be a shareholder in news provider companies. For the US, there are First Amendment considerations. Would this survive a First Amendment test? It's a good question. It works in the UK, so that's already something useful. And more important, the US already has many rules like this. So at least in theory, this is not a non-starter. And then let me conclude by saying that our main message here is going back to the public good analysis. We think this is a big public good, and as such deserves a merger review that's different from the standard, additional to, but different from the standard antitrust review. And these ideas are very much work in progress, so I really look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Sally Hubbard now, please.
All right, well, thank you, Guy and Luigi, for having me here and for throwing this exceptional conference. It's been incredibly interesting. I'd like to commend the committee on this very out-of-the-box and creative thinking, which is exactly what we need right now to solve these difficult problems. But before I dive into some questions that I have about the paper, I want to share my perspective on how I tend to think about these issues of news and tech platforms. And my background is I was an enforcer at the New York Attorney General's office and then an antitrust journalist. So I'm looking at it from a competition lens primarily. And right after the presidential election, the 2016 election, I wrote a short article that was called Why Fake News is an Antitrust Problem. And now a lot of people lined up to tell me how wrong I was about this. But after this conference, I actually think people have come around. I've heard a lot of ideas that are similar to what I was thinking. And let me explain the rationale because it relates to what I think are some of the solutions we need to be considering. So there's two primary reasons why disinformation, in my view, is an antitrust problem. And the first, as we've talked about a lot at this conference, is that Facebook and Google are competing against news publishers for user attention, data, and ad dollars. And the tech platform's business incentives run counter to the interests of news publishers. And they pull technological levers that harm the publisher's business model and advantage their own, right? They're able to keep users within Facebook and Google's own digital walls and reduce the traffic to news publishers' properties, which deprives publishers of the ad revenue, as we've discussed, that funds this journalism, which is essential to counter disinformation. And then the second reason why I wrote that disinformation is an antitrust problem is that Facebook and Google lack meaningful competition in their primary spheres of social media, online search, and online video. And as a result, their algorithms have an outsized impact on the flow of information, and Facebook and YouTube can tailor their feeds to serve their financial interests and prioritize engagement on the platform over veracity of content. Now, consumers and advertisers who are unhappy about the spread of disinformation and harmful content on Facebook and Google, or publishers that are dissatisfied with the terms of dealing with Facebook and Google, have limited options for taking their business elsewhere. Now, if digital markets were more competitive, the filter bubble would have less scale and impact, and Facebook and Google would have less influence on the flow of information globally. And if users could choose a competing platform that prioritizes the veracity of news, does not foster political polarization with engagement algorithms, and does not allow for foreign interference in elections, their ability to switch would apply competitive pressure on Facebook and Google to truly fix these problems. So as much as I commend the paper's frame of identifying news as a public good, which I think is true, and that has never been adequately funded by advertising, I also don't think that we can allow the surveillance advertising monopolies to continue and at the same time have a free and financially sound press. These two are incompatible, and the reason is because a free press requires democracy, and democracy requires a free press. But Facebook and Google's surveillance advertising business model, this is the behavioral, people have been calling it behavioral targeting. I like to call it surveillance because I think that's what it is. And it's threatening democracy in several ways, with ubiquitous surveillance of the citizenry, amplification by the algorithms of the speech that's harmful because it's the speech that makes us fearful and angry that's most engaging. The use of widespread surveillance is then used to manipulate people as the algorithms learn what messages people will be susceptible to. And this includes not just things like makeup advertising that Fiona was talking about yesterday, but will you be receptive to white supremacist propaganda? Political polarization is also promoted by algorithms progressively serving up more and more extreme content to keep you engaged. And then we have the problem of the loss of the public sphere. The solution to speech that you don't like has always been counter speech. But how can you have counter speech when everyone has their own personalized news feed and there's no public sphere to get that counter speech heard? So now, the GDPR we've talked a lot about at this conference, if it was properly implemented and complied with, it would solve a lot of the problems that I just mentioned, the threats to democracy. But do not, I have to say this, I've heard this a lot, do not buy the big tech talking point that the GDPR entrenches the monopolists. This is a talking point that I heard go out by numerous people that I knew were on their payroll all at the same time last year. And it wouldn't make sense that they would have spent millions of dollars lobbying against it if it was just going to fortify their monopoly power, okay? Now, I do think it has because they're not complying. And this only demonstrates that they cannot be regulated and may need to be broken up, right? This just, if the more that they show that no government has the power to regulate them, the more fodder they're giving to the argument that they should be broken up. So David Dayen, who's right there in the audience, he has proposed that we ban surveillance advertising. And actually, that would go a long way in solving a lot of the problems and the threats to democracy that I just listed. If you think that's too heavy-handed, you're probably underestimating how politically dangerous the surveillance architecture that these companies have built is. If you need to be appropriately terrified, read the New York Times Privacy Project. They've been doing great reporting about how politically dangerous this is. And it's important to remember that whatever is built by private industry can easily be co-opted by the government. They've written articles about how China took privately developed surveillance technology and is now using it to spy and monitor the oppressed Muslim minority in the country. It's happening in America with police departments and Google location data, so don't think it can't happen here. So if you think that's going too far to ban surveillance advertising altogether, at the very least, enforcers and regulators should be aiming to reduce those big tech choke points that we've talked a lot about at this conference so that pro-democracy innovation can occur. So if we get rid of those locks on the markets, then there's a bunch of entrepreneurs who are waiting in the wings with privacy by design innovation. There's a lot of these companies, and they're just waiting for the ability to get in, and they could also help preserve our democracy and innovate in the direction of democracy instead of away from democracy, which is where we've been headed. So antitrust enforcement would help to bring these new innovations to bear, and so would regulatory measures like interoperability and curbing invasive data collection by default. So turning back to the paper, I do really like the idea of moving away from dependence on ad revenue for publishers, but I think what appeals to me is a both-and approach. So I don't think we can have a robust press if we allow concentrated control over the flow of information. So the paper includes provisions for transparency and algorithms, but I don't think that goes far enough. I agree with what Chris Hughes said yesterday, that we actually need competition in algorithms. And so I have a bunch of questions and comments about the paper. The first question I have is, how do we protect the funding for the voucher system? So when Trump was elected, one of the first things he did was cut public funding for the arts. So maybe this is just me, my American capitalist. I never thought I'm representing the American capitalist here, but it makes me nervous to have news wholly dependent on public funding. So could we have a blend? We have public funding, we also deal with the advertising surveillance, advertising monopoly problem, and we have a blend of advertising revenue, public funding, and other potential business models. I also am worried about how do we keep this independent news monitor independent, and especially if we're giving them the data about the news diet. So I worry actually much more about government control of this surveillance architecture and the political dangers of that. So the second question I have is, to the extent that the funding for the vouchers comes from, I don't know if this was this was in the report, that some of the funding for the vouchers could come from tech platforms to preserve the Section 230 immunity. And I just want to be wary about creating any vested interest in the status quo and aligning news's financial well-being with monopoly profits. I want to say I really love the idea of citizen welfare. I think we need to start using that term a lot. You guys, citizen welfare is just a great way to look at how, especially consolidation has harms. And I love the framework that you came up with that makes it tangible and measurable, because that's always the criticism about going beyond looking just at prices, that you can't measure it. But it makes complete sense. And I think we should think about how can we incorporate citizen welfare into a lot of other areas, into expanding the idea of what consumer welfare means. Either you scrap the consumer welfare standard altogether, or you expand what a consumer means, and you realize a consumer is a human being. A consumer is also a citizen and a worker, and you can't slice and dice up a human being and say, well, you don't live in a democracy and you're getting paid terrible wages, but you've got low prices, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think this idea of citizen welfare is something that can be expanded in other contexts, and I love the way that you were able to quantify it in a quantifiable way. Okay, this is kind of one of the biggest questions and related to my intro here, is if the platforms are still hoarding attention, they're still monopolizing attention, and they're still the gatekeepers to the internet, how do we make sure we get the news consumption levels that we need? Right, so this is particularly a problem in countries where Facebook equals the internet, as we heard about yesterday. There's some with a 0 rating. There's some countries where people just use Facebook as the internet. So as long as we're preserving their incentives from their surveillance advertising business model to monopolize attention, aren't we still going to have the problem of not being able to get a piece of that attention for legitimate news? Okay, 2 more points. I really like the must-carry provision. I think that is an excellent idea you guys have in the report. that platforms could have a must-carry requirement for journalism. And then I wanted to ask, could we consider taking that a step further, as Barry suggested yesterday, and requiring that there also be neutrality and non-discrimination on the platform? And my last question is, if you continue to allow the amplification of disinformation by the engagement algorithms, because they don't just, it's not just that they're failing to take down the disinformation or the harmful content, but they're actually amplifying the harmful content. Isn't the need for news and funding of news even greater than it's ever been? Because you have to not just get the news out there, but constantly be countering all that fake news that's being amplified by the algorithms. And so shouldn't we try to decrease that burden on news publishers to counter the disinformation by promoting algorithmic competition, so that it can be algorithms that don't promote the harmful content competing, and hopefully making that burden less for publishers. So my big picture point is, I love your ideas. I want to make it a blend, because I don't think we can fix news without fixing Facebook and Google.
Rod, please.
Okay, thank you. I have the unenviable task of coming last, and so I'll try to be entertaining. I have a couple jokes and some great images, so I'll be trying to, but yeah, and a few things that haven't been said yet, I'll try to throw those in. So to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, I'm a sociologist by training, professor in the media studies department at NYU, the fastest growing department at NYU, which indicates the growing interest in media that we've seen at this conference. And I've done a lot of comparative studies looking at Scandinavia, France, and the US, and I've been particularly interested in forms of ownership. Andrea mentioned that, and public and nonprofit media. So let me start by saying this is a very impressive report, very thorough analysis, original, thought-provoking recommendations. But I see it really as composed of three main narratives, each of them compelling, but also at times contradictory and incomplete. So I want to trace out each of these narratives briefly, and I hope some of my comments will be helpful to the authors as they refine and edit, make final edits. So the first narrative emphasizes that quality journalism, as we've heard, is a public good. So I won't go through the whole rationale there, but ultimately it means that because of these certain properties of a public good, journalism, it's difficult for the producer to fully capture the complete value, the social value of that good, and so it gets underproduced in the marketplace. So there is a market failure. Quality journalism is underproduced, and if the market doesn't work, you have to have a subsidy. So where does that subsidy come from? In the US, that subsidy has traditionally come from, in two ways, through bundling. People bought a newspaper for the comics and the sports, and they also got quality news. And through advertisers paid to reach these audiences. But as the authors say, this advertising subsidy has had its cost. There was always the risk of advertising directly or indirectly biasing the content, but it was better than nothing. And at least some news organizations, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, used this advertising subsidy to produce accountability journalism. Then, according to this narrative, the internet brought these good times to the end. Craigslist started with Craigslist. Actually, it it might not have happened that way. Actually, in Norway, Schibsted, a major news media company, they actually figured this out early, and they created their own classified website, which is their biggest moneymaker now. So some news media companies might have played that out differently. So print circulation dropped. Audiences moved online. Digital advertising converted print advertising dollars into dimes, and digital platforms eventually gathered together all these dimes into billions of dollars in revenues, and they left virtually nothing for newspapers. So should we make the digital platforms share more of the advertising money with the news producers? According to this report, no. Better to make a clean break with advertising and find a better kind of subsidy. And so the report considers the alternatives. One is, and just to briefly hit some of the issues, one is philanthropy, and this is very much still on the table. You may have noticed that the Salt Lake Tribune just this last week announced that it wanted to become a nonprofit because otherwise it was going to go completely out of business as a kind of last chance to stay alive. Across the country, we have some excellent nonprofits like ProPublica and local outlets like MinnPost or the Texas Tribune. Problem is that the number, the size, And the funding of these nonprofits is minuscule compared to the size of the problem. The total funding, there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal last week that reviewed a lot of these numbers. The total funding that goes to nonprofit newsrooms, and this is this one on the left here, is a 5-year period, just to show. And so most of that money goes to public media and to education. If you looked at the total funding that goes to national nonprofits and local nonprofits together, it's about $55 million a year. While the amount of advertising that has been lost in newsroom funding, or the amount of funding that's been lost in newsroom funding from advertising is probably conservatively about $2 billion a year. New nonprofits and other online startups aren't being created fast enough to replace the legacy outlets that are disappearing. So the yellow in this chart is all of the legacy outlets that are gone, been closed, and the blue is all the new outlets, mostly nonprofits, that are being created to replace them. You can see that's almost everywhere. The yellow is much more prominent. And right, and so then the other alternative is subscription funding. So that's been talked about. Let the readers pay. The problem here, as Guy said, is that the option is only really viable for a few of the really major national brands like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and to a certain extent the Boston Globe has been able to do a little bit of that. But if you look at the rate of what rate of readers are being turned into subscribers, it's about 1% for most outlets, and that's simply not enough to make this work. So anyway, a lot of that is in this report, but this Wall Street Journal article also brings in some interesting new stats. So what's not talked about much in this report is the problem of information inequality, though this has been a theme in Andrea Prat's research. Even when they're, I think there's, besides the issue of media capture, there's also this issue of information inequality. Even when they're relatively successful, nonprofit and subscription funding end up incentivizing creation of content for only a select group of citizens, the highest income, highest education demographics. Or as the former publisher of the New York Times, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., said, that he's in the business of basically producing quality journalism for quality audiences. That's a nice kind of conflation of civic and monetary value there. Similarly, the publisher of MinPost has said his goal is to reach, he says basically monthly uniques are worse than worthless. That they really only care about 1/6 of adults, and those are the people that are really interested in news. And more importantly, they're influencers, and they're the ones that can either donate or they're attractive to local advertisers. So ultimately, it raises the question, are nonprofit news sites just creating more content for elites who already read a lot of news? And the answer is mostly yes. So what does this report recommend? Public funding, but with a twist. And to pick up on some of Francis Fukuyama's remarks yesterday, public funding of public media is the most obvious way to support journalism as a public good, based on research around the world. And Julia Cagé's table was actually from my report from a few years ago that showed that, let's see, back here. Yeah, so this is the US. This is another way to represent this more dramatically. There's the US, and there's every other leading Western, industrial democracy, including Japan in there. And then what happens when you add viewers like us? It's pretty much the same. So philanthropy does not change the dynamic at all, and this also includes advertising for a few of the public media broadcasters. But I also wanted to show the level of trust across Western Europe, public media. Sometimes people say, oh, public media, it's going to disappear. It's not disappearing in Western Europe. It's stronger than ever. And I would emphasize, France and Italy are great, but really the best public broadcasters beyond the BBC in the UK is in Northern Europe and Scandinavia and Germany. These are very strong public broadcasters and very autonomous. And so they've dealt with a lot of these issues of government intervention and figured out ways to make public media autonomous. One other slide here. We talk about the lack of trust in media, but if any media is in the US actually is kind of escaping that a little bit, it's even in the US, it's public media, and here's PBS and NPR are at the top of the media that people feel are relatively unbiased. Okay, but Francis Fukuyama is correct that we've had a hard time establishing public media on a large scale in the US. And that's probably going to continue to be the case. So the authors, I think, of this report have come up with a creative response. Give every citizen a media voucher worth $50 and let them give this money to the media outlet of their choice, or divide it up and give several outlets the money. I don't know if that was mentioned, but you could take the 50 and give 10 to 5 different ones. And this would be like the presidential campaign finance checkoff. I don't know if this was mentioned. They did say there's a kind of tension there. How would you pay for this? One way, you wouldn't link it directly, but it's kind of, that's what it's doing, is that in order to get this, this quid pro quo to maintain this Section 230 immunities, another thing you would ask is for the platforms to give some money to the Treasury, which would actually be equivalent to what the cost of this program is. So there actually was, maybe you're backing off of that, but there was, in the language I saw, a funding link there. So to be clear, there would be some state involvement. The report calls for creating an independent news monitor organization to assess compliance with a code prohibiting disinformation. And the IMN would be composed of journalists, media owners, scholars, and it would be, but it's important to get the details right here as we talked about agencies and how to have agencies that are effective and have autonomy. And I think we can learn some lessons from how the strongest public media operate in Northern Europe. And so this is also from my research that shows, so that's just looking at the different aspects. How do they do it in Germany and in the UK and in the Nordic countries? The principles are pretty consistent. They disperse the governmental and professional authority to appoint officials, either across branches of government or parties. They create staggered terms of service so that no single administration in power would have the ability to control all of the appointments. And they create an arm's-length relationship between the organization and the government in power through either multi-year charters, such as you have the Royal Charter in the UK with the BBC, or the use of intermediary buffering agencies that help protect the agency from partisan influence. So there's things that you can do, and so we can talk about that more. So except for the need to tweak the INM, I think this first narrative seems very coherent and compelling, even if it's controversial to some. The second narrative, then, is that concentration of ownership is bad for democracy and especially bad for quality journalism. Concentration makes media capture more likely, and ultimately, antitrust action against media concentration, including platform concentration, has been hampered by a narrow focus only on consumer welfare, so we need the citizen welfare standard, which I think is very compelling. And the report calls for a new way of measuring media concentration focused on audience attention shares, which I also think is very compelling. This is all very promising, and we can see, with, here's one of the fun images, the Sinclair must runs, and this was, if you may recall, where Sinclair was actually across their more than 100 channels were running the same content. It kind of gave this nightmare of what could happen with a large chain like that. So maybe this kind of antitrust could do more to stop big chains like Sinclair from completely dominating local TV. And the citizen welfare antitrust standard could also lead to maybe ultimately to the break of Facebook. But it's not clear from this report how that would actually help quality journalism, since the authors insist that they're really, at the end of the day, they don't care about advertising dollars anyway. So the link to the provision of public good journalism, as I read it, is not as airtight as in the first narrative. There's something that's also missing from this narrative, which is the problem, Andrea alluded to it, the problem not just of concentration ownership, but of form of ownership. And the funny thing is, I was thinking what was the problematic form of ownership was exactly opposite of what he was thinking. So I think the poster child for how ownership matters, ownership form matters, is this guy, Al Newharth. And here's my joke. What was Newharth like? And this kind of goes back to the discussion earlier about is Mark Zuckerman a good guy or not? And so, does it matter if Newharth's a good guy? But here's the story. So this comes from Ben Bagdikian's Media Monopoly, and Newharth was meeting with a bunch of investors, and they said, we've been talking, how do you pronounce the name of your company? Is it Gannett or is it Gannett? And Newharth said, it's pronounced money. Okay, it's not that great of a joke, but anyway, but I think that's, again, it's not I don't think it's a story of his character. It's a story of this form of ownership. And the stock market traded company that has a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value. And what did Gannett do? Gannett was the first company that, newspaper company that took that seriously, and they showed that you can make 30% profits from a newspaper company, and that set the new standard. And that was how that's how accountability journalism started going down in this country, was through the stock market traded ownership form, I would argue. And sure, some companies have resisted those. Here's a nice image too. Have resisted those pressures, like the Washington Post, and there's this classic image of Ben Bradley and Kay Graham walking out after the Pentagon Papers lawsuit victory. So some companies, but they have, like the New York Times, they had voting control of the voting stocks. So it was they had that power, a different kind of ownership form to resist those profit pressures. In these tables, we can see that the balance of forms of ownership among the largest news media companies is very lopsided. Almost all of them are stock market traded. And so this is looking at revenues. The bold ones, the largest 10 companies are in bold, so they're almost all in the stock market form. This is looking at the largest online audiences across the top 15. And again, most of these are stock market traded. And this is really, along with the lack of public media, the dominance of the stock market owners. I use the term stock market instead of publicly traded, so people don't confuse it with public media. But it's uniquely dominant in the U.S. France has almost none, and it's rare in Scandinavia. So it's just really, it's really unique, and you could argue, let's ban that. I mean, if we wanted to make a difference. So citizen, let's see. Gone wild here, and where am I? Okay, so, and so likewise with the digital platforms, is it their market share, or is it that they're stock market traded companies, and how much of the problem derives from this form of ownership? In a key paragraph in the first part of this report, the authors write, so news can be pursued independently up to a point, but there's always some area where we have to expect conflict of interest. The only way around this is to have a diversity of news outlets with a consequent diversity of operating interest. And the question is, what is the basic building block of such an independent system? Is it the individual news organization, each assumed to be unique, or does independence derive from a diversity of forms of ownership, stock market traded, privately held, civil society, nonprofit, and public? Research suggests that it does. For instance, in his book, Democracy's Detectives, James Hamilton found that the most investigative reporting was conducted by family-owned companies and by nonprofits. And I would say, in just terms of private, in my own research looking at forms of ownership in Sweden, France, and the US, what I found about private ownership is that it was the category with the largest variation. So you had some great owners that really promoted public affairs reporting, and you had some horrible ones. So it's kind of, that's what you get with that form of ownership. Okay, so finally, wrap up quickly here. The third narrative, and I think this is important though, that is a narrative about the public, who they are and what they want. And I think this is very important in thinking about the vouchers and how they'll work. The starting point of the entire report is the idea that democracy relies on the principle of one informed person, not one person, one vote, but they stress this, one informed person, one vote. But who are these informed persons and how do they get informed? The report can't quite decide what kind of public it believes in. So in one vision, the public is what Michael Shedson has called the monitorial public. In this elitist vision, what's important is that you just have a few people who are paying attention to the news. As long as you have a few elite monitors paying attention, that's enough to stop corruption and maintain democracy. So it's actually okay that a lot of people aren't following news in this vision. And in this report, we see this monitorial public in the public that is posited to be interested in transparency, in reading labels about ownership, advertisers, and algorithms. Maybe these are the people that read the terms of service, beginning to end, and in using that information to make judgments about whether or not a news outlet is trustworthy. This is also the kind of public that we would hope that would make the best choices to allocate media vouchers. They would choose quality media that do accountability reporting, especially at the local level where we need it the most. But is this an actually existing public. At other points in the report, more in the analysis than in the recommendations, one finds a second vision of the public that's more akin to Walter Lippmann's view of the public as an irrational mass public, guided by stereotypes, shaped by prejudices, rooted in their immediate interaction with their social sets. Just to bring the French angle in here, this is the same kind of public that French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu identified as shaped by their class habitus, which creates an eternal circuit where people have taste and belief shaped by their habitus, and then they only seek out media that reinforce this habitus. But this public mostly disappears in the discussion of media vouchers, because think of the implications. How would this public define the kind of quality media it wants to support? So going back to, again, I was kind of misleading on the earlier survey I showed you of like, what are the most trusted media? Because those are, that was aggregated everybody. Let's look at liberals versus conservatives. And you see that high is low and low is high. There's no consensus whatsoever here. And PBS maybe a little bit less, although it's not really high on the conservative side. But basically, some of the media, like the New York Times, which are among the highest on the Democratic side, are among the lowest on the conservative side. And those that are at the very bottom of the Democratic side are at the very top of the conservative side. So, I mean, I think this is a problem. People don't agree on anything. So what happens to public funding if this self-interested, irrational public gets to choose? They might choose a lot of media that would only increase polarization, like Fox and MSNBC. And it's, to be fair, the report anticipates this, and it says, well, you know, 30% of the people choose Fox, but we're only going to give you 1%. And I think, how are people going to react to that? I think there's going to be an outrage over that among some people on the right. Why did they only get 1% when actually everyone wants Fox? So there's some problems here, and which is not that I wouldn't like it to happen, and I'll get to that in my last level, kind of public, and I'm almost done here, 3 paragraphs. This kind of public preceded Facebook, but I think Facebook weaponized it. And this public is primed to enact its prejudices, but it doesn't have to. So I think in this way, changing the algorithms could maybe tone this down a little bit and would be worth trying. Finally, there's a more hopeful, John Dewey-style, small d, democratic vision of the public, and I'm generously reading this kind of public into the report. The authors see vouchers primarily as a way to break away from advertising, but I read it also as a way to bring a Deweyan public sphere into being. What happens when everyone suddenly has $50 to spend on media? This definition of quality, the definition of quality audience in Sulzberger's sense, I think totally expands, because media suddenly have an economic incentive to produce quality news for a much broader audience. And once that happens, there could be quality journalism, not just for so-called quality people, but for everyone. And that could help reduce the information gap. So from my point of view, that's a good place to end with, and if this is where you end up with vouchers, this is the best narrative of all. Just to sum up my key takeaways, I would argue that ways that you might improve this proposal is think through more and ways to ensure the autonomy and credibility of the INM, take into account forms of media ownership, and use media vouchers to close the information gap. Thank you.
We'll now continue straight to the media debate moderated by Jesse, and people here in the audience also can react to what we have just discussed. We're just switching the slides, and we're ready to start.